It's a joy to me to welcome all of you here this evening. We're beginning our first night of our gospel meeting tonight, our Bible studies that we're going to be having through the rest of this week and into Sunday. We are certainly glad that Brother Brent Willey is with us, and I have a lot of things to say about Brent, but I'll wait for him to pay me something first. He and I have been very, very close friends, closely associated for many, many years. And since it has been so many years since we saw each other last, it's a real pleasure for me to see him here tonight, and I'm looking forward to hearing him deliver lessons from God's Word. Glad to have Sister Vicki with us too. Will you bow with me to go to our Heavenly Father in prayer? Our gracious Father in heaven, we are so thankful to you for watching over us and having such wonderful care for us. We thank you for your mercy and your kindness, your compassion, your grace. Pray, Heavenly Father, and giving you all of the praise and honor and glory that you most rightly deserve. We thank you for the series of lessons beginning tonight. We thank you for Brother Brent Willey and his wife who are with us this evening. We thank you for all of those others who are visiting with us, and we're grateful for them. And we are so glad to study your word together. Be with us as we study. Help us to understand what we study. And especially help us to put those things in our inner mind and think seriously about your word and how it applies to us. We ask forgiveness in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.
All right.
Thank you, Don, and good evening to everyone. I want to begin by asking you a question. And let me see here. Bottom of the prayer. Is there an on and off to it?
It's thinking.
It's thinking. As long as I'm thinking. Are we good? Back up, yeah, back up. This is an anticlimactic beginning. But I do want to ask you a question at the very beginning. And I do not know but just a few of you. But my question is, do you believe in God?
Yes.
There's always one in the crowd. And if I were to follow through with that, as long as you're not verbose, why, Patrick?
I see the wonder of creation. I believe there is a creator for it.
Very good. I've asked that question of people on an individual basis. I can honestly tell you probably 300-400 times in very personal one-on-one settings. Do you believe in God? And you'll get a variety of answers to that, even as many of you are probably in your own minds conjuring a thought or an answer of how you would respond to that. Patrick expresses because he beholds the wonders of creation. Some of you may have thought, well, I've always believed in God. The influence of my parents. Maybe some said, I believe in God because of some type of experience that you've had in your life. And I suppose that while there are a variety of answers that we could give to that, the whole gist of what we want to do, even as we begin in this series of looking for meaning in life and dealing with this very first lesson of reason to believe, is that I want to suggest to you, as strongly and emphatically as I possibly can, that it makes more sense to believe in God than not to believe. And there must be a reason to believe. Fundamental to our study together is this most widely discussed and asked question, does God exist? And I say to you that if we deny His existence, we involve ourselves in so many insurmountable obstacles and questions that no reasonable person would want to face. And I hope that that becomes apparent in this lesson. Now, if we, in fact, admit His existence, and I'm going to make an assumption here, and the assumption probably is that the vast majority, if not all of you, do believe in the existence of God. But if we admit His existence, first of all, we are admitting or we are saying that He is the source of all life. Furthermore, that He is the Father or the progenitor of our spirits. That typically believers in God believe that there's something to us much more than just physiology, just a physical makeup, but that there's something very spiritual about us, and that He is the Father of our spirits. This is what the believer will certainly suggest or say. And furthermore, that if God does exist, it would very much appear that He's the basis of all truth, the greatest reality of all. Now, in the broad spectrum of belief in the world today, there are three prominent positions, particularly within our society. And the first one certainly is theism, and theism is the concept, there is the belief in God, and ism is a belief. Obviously, we have this word theos, a Greek word for God, and theism is to believe in God. We may be more specific and talk about being monotheistic, that we believe that there is one God. Now, you're certainly aware of the fact that once one looks at this position and says, I'm a believer in God, in order to negate that or to look at the opposite, all we have to do, and it's very true in both Latin and Greek, is you put an A in front of that word. And it certainly negates it. And so theism would become atheism. And let me suggest to you that while theism is the belief that there is one God and that He is the creator of all things, atheism is more than just the belief that there is no God, but a true atheist seeks to prove there is no God. Now, I'll be real honest with you that in my years of discussion with people in various scenarios or situations, that I have run onto very, very few true atheists. But most people that have questions about the existence of God find themselves in a different camp, and that camp would be the camp of agnosticism. Now, inasmuch as theism, from theos meaning God, and the atheism without God or no God, we have another word here, and agnosticism simply is the concept that we don't know. In fact, the very common Greek word that's found in the Bible a lot for knowledge or to know is gnosis, to know. And if we put an A in front of that, it simply means without knowledge. And there are a lot of people that take the position that I don't know, and the existence of God cannot be proved one way or the other. In other words, you can't prove to me that there is a God, tangibly, empirically, physically, by saying, look up there in the sky or the clouds, there's God. Not personally, necessarily. But at the same time, they'll say to the atheist, you cannot prove to me there is no God, and so agnostics freely admit we don't know. Now, I found that many of the agnostics go ahead and live like atheists, and there's no accountability, and that's another lesson. But in the scope of this study, the Bible does not argue the existence of God. Don't you find that interesting? That the very first verse of the Bible that most all of you can quote in Genesis 1:1, when Moses, who is the author of those books, he simply begins, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I find it fascinating that he didn't open and said, let's first talk about the concept of God and try to argue the existence of God. It's understood from the first verse of the Bible and on that God exists. And so while the Bible does not argue the existence of God, what of the person who either rejects the Bible or knows very little about the Bible? And how is it that they can know? You see, I cannot necessarily go to the individual that says, I don't know, to the agnostic. And they'll say, well, Brent, can you prove to me there's God? And yes, I open my Bible and say, look what it says. In the beginning, God. And I show them other passages, God. And they say, I don't know anything about that book. Or maybe they have reasons in their own mind that they have questions or doubts or skepticism about this book. And so to the person who either rejects the Bible or knows little Bible, I think it's important for us as believers and those of us that are Christians that we support belief in God, at least in part, through our observation of the universe about us. Very much Patrick's response to the question, do you believe in God? That is what we're going to refer to as external evidence. Evidence outside of the Bible. Now, I've got to make a disclaimer right now. I want you to know something. I believe the Bible to be the inerrant and inspired Word of God and our only source of authority. But I'm not going to deal with the Bible much tonight. We're going to deal with one passage in the beginning here in just a couple of moments. And when I teach this in a class level at somebody's home or one-on-one, I typically don't even take my Bible to the first class. But I don't want anybody to look at that, not a problem. I don't want anybody to look at that as though, well, this fella, he doesn't even use the Bible. Oh, I use the Bible a lot. But are you with me? As we're going to look at external evidences outside of the Bible, because there's a lot of people that don't accept the Bible, don't know much about the Bible. However, ultimately, faith that's going to be acceptable to God, that acceptable faith, the Apostle Paul makes very clear in Romans 10:17 that faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of Christ. And that's going to be supported and built upon in the course of this week, and particularly tomorrow night when we talk about Give Me the Bible. But I want to say this as well. The believer has the burden of proof. The believer. We're in the affirmative on this. It is our task to prove what we affirm, not demand that the unbeliever must prove what he already denies. He doesn't have that task. We have the burden of proof. The affirmative always has the burden of proof. And I'll tell you right now, and I mean this with all of my heart, brethren and friends, we are not trying to win a debate, we're trying to find truth. And that must always be our attitude. Now that takes us to an important passage of Scripture, and I want you to think about a statement that is made by Peter as we're going to be talking about reason to believe. And I put that reason in quotation marks for a good reason. And as we would notice in 1 Peter 3:15, a text that many of you are quite familiar with, the Apostle Peter, he writes in this epistle, this letter, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear." Now there are two words that stand out. They all stand out to a certain degree, but even as I've highlighted in the color blue there, in defense and reason, and the very first word that we're going to look at is defense. Now you may have a translation, instead of defense, it may say, ready to give an answer. A defense or an answer. The Greek word that we have is apologia. And what does that kind of sound like? An apology. And an apology does not mean, I'm sorry. You know, an apology is an apology. It's simply an explanation of something. Now, you may be sorry about something, but we will many times say to people, this is the reason why I did something, or I said something, or I behaved in a certain way. And an apologia is a verbal defense. It is a reasoned statement of argument that Thayer says in his lexicon. Now, what here is stated to Christians, to believers, is they have the responsibility to be ready to give a defense, an answer for what they believe and for what they do. And furthermore, then he employs the word logos. And many of you probably have looked at that word before. It's often identified as word. The word, Jesus is called the logos. But it is a word that sometimes is simply translated as reason. Reason. It's used of speech, a word, something someone has said, the mental faculty of thinking, reasoning. And so when we look at these, what the Apostle Peter is saying, that as people of faith and Christians, those that believe in God, are people of faith. We believe something, we're convicted of something, we're convinced about something, we're a people of faith. And here's the question, my friends, here's the question. Is there a way, and can we stand prepared, ready to give a defense, an apologia, an apologetic? Do we stand prepared, and can we give a defense that is reasonable? And absolutely we can. And don't let anybody else tell you differently. There is reason to believe in the existence of God and His power and His authority. We must reason to believe, and there is good reason to do so. It's up to each one of us to examine the evidence that is all around us. So, what am I going to do tonight? Let me see, it's 7:14. What kind of plans do you have tonight? I'm teasing you. But what I want to do for the next several minutes is I want to present to you those external evidences, even evidences outside of the Bible. We're kind of done with the Bible tonight. There'll be an allusion a little bit later on near the end, but we're kind of done with the Bible. And I want to talk about those external evidences, evidence outside the Scriptures. We look at the observable universe and humanity within it, and give you evidences of why I believe that it makes more sense to believe in God than not to. In fact, it takes a blind faith to not believe in God. And we're accused of that. Now, let's deal then with the God who is there. Why we can acknowledge the God who is there and the evidences of that. And the very first thing that I want to say to you, that the evidence I give to you, I believe that God exists, and it makes more sense to believe that God exists than He doesn't, is because the universe exists. Isn't that profound? And I know you've waited for how many months for me to come and tell you the universe exists. This is a fact that is so self-evident, no reasonable person would begin to say, well, no, wait a minute. I got to tell you, I was studying with a young gal who was going to college many, many years ago. Forget what her major was, biology, I believe. But as we were talking about, then I said this very thing, the universe exists. She says, I'm not sure about that. And I knew it was going to be a rough go. The point is that we know the universe exists, and yet every effect must have an adequate cause. That is what we know scientifically, is that nothing exists just simply by... It can't exist by accident. In fact, here's what we understand. Something cannot come from nothing. Every effect must have an adequate cause. We talk about cause and effect. And we look at this pulpit, for example. And we realize that something cannot come from nothing. And you just didn't show up when you decided to get this building and to use this for your assembly, for your church services, and so forth, and walk in one day and just here it is, and you said, where'd that come from? Well, I don't know. And nobody's, well, did you bring it? Did you bring it? No, well, it just must have appeared. We know better than that. And we realize that something cannot come from nothing. This is something that's very tangible, it's very physical, it's very observable. That every effect must have an adequate cause. And all agree to this. Since the universe exists and something cannot come from nothing, then something or someone has always existed. That is a scientific fact. Something cannot come from nothing, so something or someone has always existed. Now, the evolutionist or the materialist asserts that it is matter that has always existed. And that matter existed before mind, and that whatever the numbers that they may give, from millions or billions and billions of years ago, there was dead inert matter. And some of the newest theories is that matter was so dense that the weight of the universe, of this expanding universe, was contained in a relatively small size of a large marble. But the density, I mean, have you ever thought the difference of weight between a cup full of mercury and a cup full of water? Density, right? Now I want you to think about a marble that's the weight of the universe. That's heavy. But for some unexplained reason, within the theory of the Big Bang Theory, that this incredibly super densified, is that a word? This material, that as it exploded, that it formed and all from these fragments of the universe that's about us and all that we're going to see. And they say matters are, but the whole question becomes, where did the marble come from? You see, they've already agreed that something cannot come from nothing. Something or someone has always existed. The believer, so as we look at this, it's a matter of mind versus matter. The Christian, the believer, on the other hand, we believe that mind is greater than matter. For example, mind knows matter is the object known. Let me ask you, what is this pulpit that's primarily made out of wood and some other materials? What does it know? And you look at it and say, that's a ridiculous question. It is the object that is known. Mind knows matter is the object known. We could put our minds together, and could we replicate that? Yes, we could. We understand furthermore that matter is not intelligent. Again, it knows nothing. It cannot do anything of and by itself except for deteriorate. And so we look at this and we say mind versus matter. The whole idea is matter is not eternal. And science has come to understand that as well. That when we consider that matter is not eternal, I want you to think about the stars, suns all over the universe. in our Milky Way galaxy and beyond. We know, as a matter of fact, that stars are losing mass and energy. They're getting smaller, slow but sure, losing mass, losing energy. I want you to think, just suppose that you had a brand new flashlight, and you put a brand new bulb in there, and you put a brand new set of batteries in there, and when you first turn that flashlight on, you're going to have maximum output, aren't you? But if you leave that flashlight on, what's going to happen is going to dim, 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 until finally it's extinguished and goes out. Even if you use the copper top batteries. I mean, it's going to go out. The point is that we have that's happening in the universe all about us and even the stars, and all of these things show that the universe and the physical part of the universe cannot be eternal because things are losing. They're, in the laws of entropy, and we understand that in all of this, that things are getting smaller and the energy is running out. Those things that are happening. We consider this. If matter had a beginning then, what's our answer? If matter had a beginning, and something cannot come from nothing, therefore something or someone has always existed, and matter had to have a beginning. It had to. Then what does that leave? Mind. Intelligence. And what we might even say in the superior mind or thinking of God. Brethren, how often do we even use the expression of mind over matter? Sir James Johns, a physicist, said if the universe is a universe of thoughts, then its creation must be an act of thought. And there's no doubt that it is an act of thought. Dr. Edwin Conklin, noted biologist, put it this way when he said that the probability of life originating from accident is comparable to the probability of the unabridged dictionary resulting from an explosion in a printing shop. Now I want you to just think about that here's a fellow working in his printing shop, and for some unexplained reason there's an explosion that takes place, kaboom. He lands out in the middle of the street, he picks himself up, he begins to knock the ash and the soot off of him, and he looks over the middle of the street and he says, Eureka, here is a beautifully bound unabridged dictionary, all bound together, leather bound, pages in order, perfect definitions in alphabetical order, and he begins to tell people that this is the product of the result of this explosion, that this book had never existed. And if somebody went around and reported that, you would come to another assumption that in the explosion he hit his head. There's no way, because that's not reasonable. Mathematically, it is not reasonable. It's just not reasonable at all. The universe exists. Something cannot come from nothing. But then let me suggest to you, not only does the universe exist, and we see that we have this great responsibility, we're going to see also that the universe that exists shows signs of design and purpose. It's not a matter of just existing by random chance, by accident. Because we look at the universe, the world in which we live, the planetary system in which we exist, the Milky Way galaxy in which we sit. When we look at everything about the universe and all of the study and the observation that we have done, we see harmony, we see symmetry, we see so many things that show that in all of this, there's design and there's purpose in it all. Once you consider the immensity of the universe in which we live is a tremendously big something. We often refer to the ever-expanding universe. It expands and expands. And our own little situation in our solar system, the Earth's distance to the sun is nearly 93 million miles away. That's a sizable distance, comparatively speaking. And yet it is a short distance when we consider the overall immensity or vastness of the universe. Sirius, which is the brightest star in the heavens from our perspective, not the closest star, but the one that's brightest to us, that it is 51 million miles away. In fact, how do we measure the distance of many of the stars in the galaxies that we're able to observe with sophisticated telescopes today? We measure it in terms of light years. That is speed. A light year is light traveling at 186,000 miles per second, not hour. And you just start doing the math of how many seconds are in a year and multiply it towards that, and you come up with this phenomenal number, and that's 1 light year. And we see stars every night that are said to be thousands of light years away. That boggles my mind. Boggles my mind. Well, the immensity of the universe in itself and its vastness, we might find it difficult to comprehend its vastness and its complexity, but no one can fail to see design and purpose in it all. And first of all, the mathematical precision. How is it that so much is absolutely dependent upon mathematics and the laws, the rules of mathematics? There's a few of you that are probably very good at math. Some of you are probably very good at math. And when we look at this and we think, how is it that scientists can foretell an eclipse of the sun or the moon? And we just had a lunar eclipse here just a few weeks ago. And depending on where you are, for example, in the Western Hemisphere, scientists can tell you in years in advance, they can tell you that there's going to be an eclipse. And if you're in this part of the world, in the Western Hemisphere, that on this day and precisely to the very minutes when that's going to take place. You know why? Because of the consistency of mathematical principles. That's some accident. You see, people are saying, and sometimes we are chided for our belief in God. And if somebody's looking at the mathematical precision of which our universe operates, and our universe is about chemicals and mathematics, that's all I can tell you. And the correlation between chemistry and mathematics is huge. But to suggest that that is some kind of accident, an accident because of an explosion billions of years ago, is preposterous. We understand that the universe shows signs of design and purpose. Not only that, the exacting conditions that we have that makes life possible, for example. As I said, we're 93 million miles away from the sun. The surface temperature of the sun is about 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And yet we're just far enough so that the sun warms us, because if we were half that distance closer, it would burn up, as far as the life as we know it. If we were half the distance farther away, we would absolutely freeze, like some of the other planets that are more distant than we are, and yet it's just far enough away. The moon, which is about nearly 220,000 miles away, which controls in many respects our tides of the ocean. We live right next to the ocean. And as we see the tides that come and look at our books, and we understand the gravitational force and the correlation between the moon, and if the moon were only 120,000 miles away, that our tides would be so enormous that twice a day our mountains would soon be eroded away. I mean, you can go after fact after fact. Our Earth, which when sits in parallel relationship to the sun, we all understand that the Earth is not a perfect sphere, round. It's a little elliptical, and it sits on an axis at 23 degrees. It's tilted at 23 degrees. And as we're spinning around, and then as we're going around the sun, and that tilt as we go around, and the orbit is very elliptical around the sun, that gives us our seasons. If that 23 degrees wasn't there, twice a year, our polar caps would probably nearly meet at the equator, if it were not for this slant. The question is that you look at all of these different exacting conditions that make life possible. Is that an accident, or do we see design and purpose in it all? Now, so many points that could be made. We live in what we might say is an infinitesimal atomic and molecular system. And within the atom itself, within the world of the atom itself, we've talked about the vastness of the immensity of the universe just work in reverse. And I remember taking a physics class many, many years ago, and there was an illustration given in a film that we were watching of a man walking down the street, and at first he looks up into the sky and into the heavens, and it just shows, and pretty soon it became animated because it was a time there were things out there we didn't even know what it really was. And so that's when you go to cartoons to illustrate it. But it was just showing how big the universe was. But after it did that, then it reversed itself, and it came back to that man in the street, and right down to a cell on his arm, to the molecular structure, right down to the atom, and showing that the makeup of the atom, which becomes a world in and of itself. I mean, from the vastness to this infinitesimal system within us, and it is, I don't care if it's a cell in a human being or on a plant. It is an amazing world with these exacting conditions. It is quite marvelous. What's the point? Is this all an accident? the universe shows signs of design and purpose. Dr. A. Cressy Morrison, in reference to these, said it is apparent from these and a host of other examples that there is not one chance in billions that life on our planet is an accident. And he points out that when you look and observe our universe, we live in a universe, in a world that's operated on principles of law. You know what we sometimes say? The laws of nature. Oh, it's the law of nature. By the way, when people say, well, some of these points you're talking about, it's just, it's just like nature. It's just Mother Nature. You know what that becomes? That's called an equivocation, a cop-out. If they say laws of nature, Mother Nature, and what they mean by superior intelligent mind, they're simply just using another term for God. Did you hear what I'm saying? We live in a world that absolutely depends upon laws. Those laws of nature. Laws of science. Laws of math. Laws. There must be a lawgiver. We live in a world, again, that's based on these mathematical precision. And you talk about true math being a perfect science. There must be a mathematician. And you speak of engineering skill. That, again, when you look up the molecular makeup of the world in which we live and the atomic structure, and you want to talk about engineering skill and start studying the design of what we know the design of DNA. Good book to read. I don't have a quote from him, should, but Francis Collins, who just recently, by the way, came up in the news again because with the Ebola scare, and they called him on, that he was the one that President Clinton some years ago appointed to be head of the Genome Project. And Francis Collins, who had been for many years a devout atheist, has reversed himself completely. He's written a book called The Language of God, and he's come to the conclusion that DNA, there's only one answer to DNA, and that's God. And he said, by the way, I didn't plan on this, but, we can do all these things. But I'll tell you what, he brought out the point because some of the evolutionists will say, well, we've done some studies and we've shown that the DNA of chimpanzees and the DNA of human beings are very close. And Dr. Collins says, no kidding. He said, the fact of the matter is, the DNA of a banana slug has a lot of similarities to the DNA of human beings. He says, you know why? He says, because life comes from life. He says, because when you're talking about life and various molecules in the atomic structure and so forth, we all share a lot of commonalities because of the common factors from oxygen to the various vitamins and all that takes place that composes us. He says that proves nothing except for that it is life. And where did this life come from? It's an interesting, here's the point. Is there a lawgiver? Is there a mathematician? Is there an engineer? I'll tell you what, he's God. That's the lawgiver. That's the mathematician. That's the engineer. It is God. Now, you think about this, and our existence, it's creation versus evolution is the primary debate that takes place in our society and has for a number of years. And we're faced with two choices. And number one, as I certainly would suggest to you, and I think that there's reason to believe, and it makes more sense to believe in this than the alternative, but that God created man. And this accounts for humanity's intellect, our ability to reason, to have intelligence, to learn, to progress, to advance. It accounts for his asceticism, why we love art, music, and things that are beautiful, and why eating is 60% aesthetic. Don did a pretty good job on the stew tonight, the soup, but the table setting as a whole was beautiful. And you know what that does? We appreciate things like that. Dogs don't care. It accounts for our moral awareness. It accounts for a religious intuition that we want to serve something. And it accounts for our dominion on the earth. All I can tell you, if the chimpanzees and the dolphins are so smart, why aren't they running things? There is something that's different. But the other alternative, certainly, is that man is the product of evolution. And it assumes life mysteriously evolved from existing matter over a period of billions of years as a result of random chance and accident. And I'm just here to suggest to you that it takes more belief, more faith, to believe in the second alternative than the first. Now, I want to give you, if we run down this, 5 reasons we should reject evolution. 5 reasons that we should reject evolution. And I suggest to you that, first of all, number 1, the reason why I reject evolution, though it needs to be explored and studied with a very open mind, because that's how we should approach everything in life. Look at the facts. Look at what the situation is. Even as believers and Christians, we should never close our minds to any arguments that are presented. We have to be honest, intellectually honest, and look at it. Would you not agree? But I reject evolution, number 1, because evolution is an unproved theory. It's an unproved theory. But how many children from very small age, from elementary school, going through secondary education, and to even our major colleges and universities, how many of them are being told, of course, well, that evolution is a fact. Evolution is a fact. Again, going back to another study I had one time, and a young lady had said to Vicki and myself in the study, and she says, well, evolution is a fact. And I said, how do you know that? And she says, because Dr. Thompson, the biology teacher, said it was. And one may have as many degrees behind his name as a thermometer, but I'm telling you what, that just because somebody states it does not necessarily mean it. Evolution is an unproved theory. When we look at this, a theory, and there's a difference between scientific fact and scientific theory. You know, when it comes to scientific fact, and it took a while to figure this out. How about Isaac Newton? And I don't know about the validity, the veracity of the story of an apple falling on top of his head one day, but as we understand that when I do this, that is a principle known as what? Gravity. Now, we've pretty much come to the conclusion, even though there's still some theoretical things about gravity. I see Kevin over there smiling, and there are. But do you all embrace the fact of gravity? What comes up must come down. Why my wife hates to fly. We understand that. There is a difference, though, between scientific fact and scientific theory. Now, theory is a belief not yet tested in practice, or a hypothesis, or something assumed as a starting point for a scientific investigation. And while there are a lot of things that started off theoretical, what did they have to do? They had to test it. They had to put it in real situations, laboratory, natural, and otherwise. But it is something that is assumed as a starting point, but you've got to actually be able to prove it, and furthermore, you've got to be able to duplicate it. You know, a lot of people miss that point. They have been trying to control laboratory situations to duplicate some of their theoretical beliefs and can't do it, but yet still want to tell us, well, this is the only answer. We have to be very honest about this, and there are some scientists that through the years, past and present, that continue to keep it theoretical, and I just want to go over a few of these. Sir Arthur Keith of the British Museum, an evolutionist, said evolution is unproved and unprovable. We believe in it because creation is unthinkable. Well, you look at that, and he's right. It's unproved and unprovable. But as many of them, he says, but we're going to accept it because creation is just unthinkable. What kind of science is that? Professor Fleischmann, zoologist of Erlangen in Scotland, and I might add, an evolutionist, says the Darwinian theory of descent has not a single fact to confirm it in the realm of nature. It is not the result of scientific research, but purely the product of imagination. And if you're all familiar with Darwin and the Galapagos Islands and off the coast, western coast of South America and what he found there, and the tremendous work that he did within cataloging species and types of animals and so forth. But you've got to understand that what he did is by virtue of a product of imagination came up with a theory, and is a theory that has changed off and on throughout the last 150, 200 years. But notwithstanding, it's a theory. Sir William Dawson, Canada's great geologist, in Who's Who's book of science over and over again, he said, evolution, is the strangest phenomena of humanity. It is utterly destitute of proof. We look at it by Robert Millikan, physicist, Nobel Prize winner. He said the pathetic thing is that we have scientists who are trying to prove evolution, which no scientist can ever prove. Dr. E.A. Houghton, a Harvard evolutionist, he said, we sin against genetic science when we depend on mutations to prove evolution. And he just says we've got to abandon that. That's not working. It's not going to work. And we've got to recognize that. Dr. David Pilbeam, who's an anthropologist, says many evolutionary statements have very little to do with real data and a great deal to do with unstated assumptions. We're talking about what are we going to believe based upon what? Evidence, not just assumptions. Many of you are familiar with Dr. Richard Leakey. Dr. Richard Leakey was a paleoanthropologist, and he said he's done a lot of work in Africa, and has left anthropology, paleoanthropology, to his wife and his son at this point, and who is a conservationist and involved in politics, still living. But he said, if I were to draw a family tree for man, it would be a question mark. And I think you should have just left it there. Dr. Colin Patterson says, I know of no transitional fossils. Evolution is based on faith alone. And as he's from by the way, from the British Museum and an evolutionist, an avowed evolutionist, but he admits the fossil record does not show evolution. Where are the transitional fossils? Where's the in-between? Where's the in-between states? If it took millions or billions of years, why do we have fossils of various kinds of critters? Oh, some of them are extinct. They're no longer here. But you know what? Look like a bird, look like a lizard, look like some fish. But what about these in-between, and especially in transmutation from aquatic to reptilian to primate? Where are the transitional fossils? They don't exist. They're not going to, because there are none. Dr. Gary S. Calton, chemist, natural byproduct chemist in Glen Burnie, Maryland, who Don and I have known for a good number of years. Gary's been a good friend of mine for many years. There is nothing scientific about Darwin's theory, since it did not result from research and investigation, but was assumed and accepted upon mere speculation. And so they have made it very, very clear. And I close with Dr. Bernard Covell, an astrophysicist. He says, for 20 years I've tried to prove the universe had a materialistic base, but every experiment failed. I had to conclude that it had a spiritualistic base. Interesting quotation. I reject evolution because it's an unproved theory. Number two, I reject evolution because it cannot stand the test of irreducible complexity. It cannot stand the test of irreducible complexity. There's a book that I suggest everybody get and read. And he's written it in such an understandable way. His name is Dr. Michael Bay, biochemist professor at Lehigh University. And has written this book, and this is what he has deemed or termed as irreducible complexity. Well, what is that? Irreducible complexity is when, he says, a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system effectively to cease from functioning. Is that clear? Did you get that? Well, let's try to simplify that and illustrate in a moment. Simply put, in irreducible complex systems, there are necessary components in order for that system to function and survive. They're necessary functions. Removed, the system totally fails, survival is impossible. Let's talk about a mousetrap. The basic household mousetrap. Overall, basically, with the exclusion of the staple or two, it has a wooden platform, it has a metal hammer that comes down upon the poor unsuspecting mouse. It has a spring that catapults it. It has a catch release where the bait is put, and it has this metal bar that holds that spring. And I want to ask you, just remove any one of those components and tell me how that mousetrap's going to work. It's not going to work. This is the point. And here's the point, that biological systems require a structure-function relationship, even like a mousetrap. But biological systems, and we're biological, very biological, and we are a structure-function relationship, or have that relationship that inevitably blocks Darwinian-style evolution. Why? Because survival becomes impossible when components that are necessary for successive life are missing initially. Listen to this carefully. If the development of human life was gradual, and that's axiomatic in the evolutionary theory, because evolution requires what? Billions of years. Billions and billions of years. How could the deficient organism survive, mutate, and reproduce? The mousetrap's not going to survive. A biological system not going to. That takes faith to believe that. Well, let's make this real, and this is an actual molecular. It's a molecule. Vitamin K is a molecule, and that is actually the structure of vitamin K in that little illustration there. Molecule, vitamin K, very important for what? Necessary for blood clotting and survival. Without vitamin K, we would be extremely hemophilic. And I'm going to tell you, there's no time for development. When you look at vitamin K, if the evolutionary theory, and in that evolutionary theory, vitamin K gradually occurred in the development of human beings, how can this be? Vitamin K is a necessary component in the integrated biological system, like the human body. And the absence of it, we couldn't survive. Biological systems would just bleed to death. There was no time for gradual development of essential molecules like vitamin K and many others. They're all necessary components. How could that happen? You just couldn't survive. It would end it. Interesting quotation. Charles Darwin himself knew that his theory of gradual evolution by natural selection carried a heavy, heavy burden. And here's the quote that we have from Darwin. As a matter of fact, in his Origin of Species, of the Species, 6th edition, page 154, he says, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive or slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Guess what? It broke down. His theory breaks down. There is no time for it. Anthony Flew, contemporary with us today, who had been an avowed atheist, in his video series, Has Science Discovered God? ABC News, back in 2004. He says, in reference to DNA, as shown by almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved. I reject evolution because it cannot stand the test of irreducible complexity. Well, number 3, I reject evolution because it has no evidence of a missing link. How many of you have heard that? The missing link. They're looking for the missing link. Now, I'm going to tell you this. When I was a sophomore in high school, Mr. Boudreau was our biology teacher. He taught some evolution. He was also the swim coach. Hairiest man I ever saw in my life. Those guys that started shaving right here and down. And his back, you don't even want to think about it. We thought, he is the missing link. Very interesting, this whole idea of the missing link. A quotation that comes from Anthony Stanton in his book, Science is a Sacred Cow, and science has plenty of its own sacred cows. He says, it is a most misleading phrase because it suggests that only one link is missing. It would be more accurate to say that the greater part of the entire chain is missing, so much that it's not entirely certain whether there is a chain at all. See, they want us to believe, we're just about there. We're just about there. We're just looking for that missing link. They're just going to put it all together, and they're saying, you know what? It's not a matter of just missing the link. Where is the chain? But as we think about that, how many of you have seen the various pictures of prehistoric men? And I remember even in elementary school, first time I was exposed to this, probably about 5th or 6th grade, and in the science book, there's the kind that had the color floppy page that came out. And it starts off with a single cell amoeba in this primordial sludge, and then we got this aquatic thing going reptilian, and then various stages of primates, and at the end is a man, in a 3-piece suit carrying a briefcase. And here's the whole idea or the concept of we have these skeletons of these prehistoric men. They have been, as Stanton said, most misleading. Many have been led to believe that whole skeletons have been found to bridge the gap that's so diligently sought after, and such is far from the truth. Even when one of Leakey, Dr. Richard Leakey, is one of his individuals that was working his team, found one of the so-called ancient types and a full skeleton. And you have to understand that it was an African boy, but as they looked at the skeletal remains, let me tell you that how they had it looking, and him looking in his full bloom, was so much imagination of what they've added to it to make it look surely suppositional. But you think about it. Have any of you ever heard of the Heidelberg Man? The Heidelberg Man, discovered in Germany in 1907, consisted of one jawbone. The rest was plaster of Paris. The Java Man was found in Indonesia in 1891-1892 excavation. Consisted of a cranial cap, a thigh bone, and a few teeth, and it could never be proved that those bones came from the same creature. The original Peking Man consisted of one tooth in China, consisted of one tooth in China in 1927. Later in that area, 15 partial cranias were found, 11 mandibles of the lower jawbone were found, but then those bones were all mysteriously lost as they left China. Don't happen to this day. The Piltdown Man, considered by the Encyclopedia Britannica to be the greatest discovery of the 20th century. And what happened in 1911, a part of a human skull was found in a gravel pit near Sussex, England. And in 1953, scientists announced some further studies that proved that the jawbone was an orangutan. And what these scientists had done is they'd taken some of these bones, they bleached them with iodine so that carbon-14 dating could not be given to them, went out and buried them, came back later and dug them up and said, look, we found, and they came up with the Piltdown Man, and Encyclopedia Britannica said, greatest find of the century, proved to be a hoax, and the leading scientists of the world were taken in by the fraud. The book that you just recently read by Arnold Schnabel, and Has God Spoken? Heard him speak many, many, many years ago, and so basically you can take the bones of the prehistoric men and fit them in a reasonable sized suitcase. The rest is of suppositional artistic plaster of Paris. Dr. E.A. Hooton said these alleged restorations of ancient types of men have very little, if any, scientific value and likely to mislead the public, so put not your trust in reconstructions. Biologist Austin Clarke said man is not an ape, and in spite of the similarity between them, there's not the slightest evidence that man descended from an ape. There are no such things as missing links, missing links, or misrepresentations. Don't put your trust in reconstructions. They are misleading. Then I want to suggest to you that number 4, that I reject evolution because evolution does not account for the characteristics that humans possess that are fundamentally absent in animals. And I just want you to think about this. You know what animals have? That human beings have that animals do not have, the capacity of rational thoughts. That ability to reason, have rational thought. And this is to be distinct, to be opposed or distinguished from instinctive behavior, behavior modification, or even in conditioned reflexes, if you've ever studied much about Pavlov's dog. I'm going to tell you right now that we have the ability of rational thoughts and to improve our life, to build tools, to build buildings, to advance education. Now, we can teach Trigger, the horse, how to count. And there's a lot. We can shock him. I'm not suggesting we do that. We can feed him. We can not feed him. But we can get Trigger to count. Trigger, how old are you? And he'll be conditioned. Because he stomps his foot. Get Trigger to teach another horse to do that. No. Doesn't have the ability to do that. Oh, Lucy the ape, if you've studied about her, she was able, and certainly apes, they can take sticks, and they do show, their little baby apes how to take a stick and how to pound something. We live on the coast. We watch the little sea otters. And the little sea otters, they take rocks and they break open abalone. But why are they still using sticks and rocks? They can't build tools. It's just not. There's a difference. We have the capacity of rational thought. There is a distinction. We possess that. Human beings have a sense of morals. Absolutely a sense of morals. In fact, F.E. Hamilton, his base of Christian faith, says, man alone of all earthly creatures does wrong willfully or ignorantly. He disobeys the laws of his nature, fails to at complete fulfillment even when desiring it. He says, theft is no crime in a monkey or bear. Bloodthirstiness is no vice in a tiger, nor vanity in a peacock. A dishonest or cruel or vain man breaks the laws of his own nature. Go to the zoo. You go to the zoo, can you imagine? And there's the cage and all the monkeys, and they're playing, and you're being entertained. And you give a banana, hand it to the bars of the monkey. And this one monkey is just peeling, get ready to, and another monkey swings by and steals the banana from that monkey. And we say, zookeeper, I just witnessed a crime. But, you want to know something? When we take something that belongs to somebody else, you don't like that, do you? You see, we have a sense of morals. Good notes, by the way. We have a sense of morals, and that's to be distinguished. Not only that, we have aesthetic nature that I referred to earlier. We appreciate, inherent in human beings, the capacity to appreciate, to enjoy the beautiful and the harmonious. I'll tell you, a monkey or dog is unmoved by an exquisite orchid or a beautiful sunset. But we appreciate those things. Furthermore, we have a conscience. Tell me, what kind of people would we be if we didn't have one? We have a conscience. And again, this is something so much different. And while it's not an organic part of the body, or anything that we could have inherited from supposed animal ancestors, it's a real part of our being. A conscience. These characteristics in human beings that animals do not have prove two things. Number one, man was created in the image of a personal God. And number two, there is something in us that's not material. The soul. And that separates us from the animal kingdom as well. I want to close with the fifth reason why I reject evolution as the answer. And that's because its logical consequence is the selective breeding of humans. And some people think, well, could that ever really be the case? Its logical consequence is the selective breeding of human beings. Charles Darwin said himself, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. So, do we take those that are born with genetic defects, and what do we do? Well, it leads to this kind of a belief. Dr. Woolsey Teller, founder of the American Association for the Advancement of Atheism, and no friend of mine, said someday, when the world gets wiser than it is today, it may take up selective breeding of humans. How about the master race? How about the Aryan race? You see, if there's really no difference, why is it wrong to kill a human being, but not wrong to kill a chicken? Adolf Hitler didn't have a suitable answer to that question either. And over 3 million Jews were exterminated because there was the goal to develop a master race. Dr. George Simpson, who is the curator in Washington, D.C. at Smithsonian, says the means of biological evolutionary process are already becoming clear, although it is doubtful whether we are ready to yet apply them well. And went out and talked about potentially the idea of human breeding, selective breeding of human beings. Evolutionary thought, my friends, endorses moral relativity. It has to. If there is no God, and we're here by accident, who makes the rules? Is it going to be the survival of the fittest? Is it going to be might is right? Then who is it to tell you or to tell me this is right or this is wrong? I'll make up my mind of what is right and wrong. No God, no standard, accident, random, philosophically, sociologically, morally, ethically, out of bounds. Totally out of bounds. the alternative to God cannot be proved. Most of you are familiar with the statement in Psalm 14 verse 1, the Davidic Psalm. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Why would one be considered a fool to make such a statement emphatically, there is no God? Number one, he must deny his own nature and lower himself to the level of a brute animal. Number two, he must close his mind to the evidence of the universe itself. That we have just done a thumbnail sketch of tonight, ladies and gentlemen. But he's got to close his mind to that. And number three, from a logical and scientific standpoint, he is utterly unequipped to make such a declaration and incapable of proving it. In fact, for someone to say there is no God and to be emphatic and say, I'm right about this, there's no God, he would have to be omnipresent, everywhere, all of the time, because where he is not, God might very well be. And we sometimes wish we could be at 2 or 3 places at once, though we can't. He'd have to be omnipresent. Not only have to be omnipresent, he'd have to be omniscient. He'd have to know everything about everything, because the very things that he admits that he doesn't know may prove or point to the existence of God. And sometimes there's some people we know that think they know everything that none of us do. And he'd have to be eternal. Because maybe long before he lived, God demonstrated himself in a variety of ways. Or maybe sometime after he will have died, God will demonstrate himself. I'm going to tell you right now, you take the so-called individual that's omnipresent and omniscient and eternal, you don't have a human being, you've got God. Those are the characteristics of God, and then we'll go ahead and add to that his omnipotency as well, his all-powerfulness. In short, the presumption of this finite being, human being, whose lifespan is just a dot in the pages of eternity, who knows only one little section of one little planet in a vast universe, who's surrounded by multiple inscrutable mysteries, who cannot say for sure where he came from, where he's going, or even if he will be here tomorrow. And making such a declaration that there is no God is nothing short of amazing. Does God exist? The evidence says yes. And I hope that we can see why it makes more sense to believe in God than not to in our brief time together. And I'm going to tell you, you have been really, really patient. And I did pretty good because I've been walking on pins and needles of how long it might take me to go through some of this. Seriously. But I hope that if anything, that this will motivate you to further investigate. But now you've got to ask the question. If I accept and embrace the existence of God, and I'm sure that if not all of you, most of you do, and if those that have questions, you know what? Don't be afraid of those questions, but also possess intellectual honesty. Look at it honestly. But if we accept God, then we've got to ask the question, what am I going to do with this belief in God? And what does God expect of me, if anything? And this will take us to an examination of the Bible. The divine message from God. That's going to be the question. Is this a message from God? Or is this simply the byproduct of a man? And so tomorrow night we're going to talk about give me the Bible. Apologetically, give explanations, other kinds of evidence as we begin to look and explore to the internal evidence within the Bible itself. And the lesson is ours. Maybe you're here tonight and you fully understand this and have for a long time. And again, I don't know you, most of you. And I know that you've got some very, very talented Christian people right here that would be happy to sit down with you and talk to you about your questions, about your spiritual needs. We want to offer to you the invitation of Christ Himself. If you're to that point and you understand what you need to know, and understand with that knowledge what you need to do, then the invitation is certainly extended to you, and with your confession of faith based upon repentance of sins, if you recognize it, know what that really means and what it means to become a Christian, to be buried in the waters of baptism, I know that there are individuals that can help you with that tonight. But maybe you're several steps away from that. That's all right. But let's sit down and talk about it. Whatever your spiritual need may be, if we can help you or assist you in that, won't you please communicate that? Won't you come together? We stand as we sing the song of the